Hi, my name is Alicia, and you're watching the Reptile Rendezvous. So if you clicked on this video, you are probably looking to buy your first pet reptile, or you're just here out of curiosity. And I want to start by clarifying that any one of these pets and any animal in general can be kept, even if it's your first reptile, as long as you're doing the proper research and have the proper resources ahead of time for these animals. For example, a Nile monitor is much more difficult to care for and requires a lot more money and time than your typical leopard gecko. So in this video, we're going to look at pets that are commonly kept and considered as beginner pets, but in reality oftentimes are not really that beginner friendly. But of course, I'm not going to leave you guys hanging, so I will be giving alternatives to these animals that may work a little bit better for you. So let's get into our list of top 5 animals that are not so beginner friendly. The first animal on this list is ball pythons, also known as royal pythons. Now, if you looked into keeping any snakes at all, I know for a fact you have seen information about these guys or seen pictures of the thousands of morphs that exist. These snakes are found on pretty much every single vendor table, and they are sold in abundance. Now, even though their population is insane just in North America, they are actually native from West and Central Africa. They get about 5 to 6 feet and are a moderately sized snake for the average keeper. Now, in the case of new keepers, these snakes are very attractive. They are very calm and gentle in most cases, which is something that most of the time people who have never kept snakes look for. This creates situations where people feel more comfortable handling their snakes or even just interacting with them in general, such as like feeding them or cleaning their enclosures. That being said, what makes this species very difficult and why I believe they're not necessarily beginner friendly is actually their lighting and humidity requirements. So the minimum enclosure size for a ball python is a 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot enclosure. And this makes, by default, heating and humidity more difficult because you are required to heat and keep humid a larger space. On top of this, they require a humidity from 60 to 80% at almost all times and a spike of 80 to 100% at nighttime. Maintaining this humidity can be very difficult for someone who does not necessarily know or have the experience to do so. That's why I genuinely don't believe that ball pythons should be considered beginner snakes unless someone is prepared to do thorough research and have to pay a huge attention to the parameters in their enclosure. My pick for a personal alternative for a ball python would be a corn snake. So corn snakes are actually native to North America rather than Africa, and they reach around the same length as ball pythons do. So if you're looking for a moderately sized snake, they will fit that category just as well. Their minimum enclosure size is the same, but they require basking temp at 90 degrees Fahrenheit and a 65% to 75% humidity range, which in the case of a new keeper is a lot easier to maintain. And when it comes to morphs and general availability, corn snakes also have lots of different morphs, and they are also very available. They are found at vendor tables just like ball pythons. Maybe a little less so, but they definitely are very available. The next species I'm going to be talking about was actually my first ever reptile. Luckily, I had done a lot of research prior to getting this animal, but I still had to make tons of changes as I learned more because really the reptile hobby is constantly changing, and especially when you take animals that are considered beginner friendly, sometimes they're not as beginner friendly as we think. So we are going to be talking about bearded dragons. So bearded dragons are a semi-arboreal species from Australia, and they actually spend a lot of their time on branches in the wild. They require a basking spot of 108 to 113 degrees Fahrenheit and a humidity of 30 to 60%, which is relatively easy as long as you're using a heating source that has a high enough wattage to attain those temperatures. They are also omnivorous, which is super fun for some keepers because they get to watch their animal eat insects, but also get to make them salads, as I like to call them, every single day for them to enjoy. They do get from 20 to 24 inches in length, which can be a pretty big size considering the amount of enclosure space they need. The minimum enclosure size is actually a 4 by 2 by 2, just like ball pythons, but in this case you also need to make sure that you have ample climbing opportunities for your bearded dragon as well. Although I do recommend climbing opportunities for any animal, for a semi-arboreal species, it is essential for their overall happiness. Now, in the case of bearded dragons, it's not necessarily their care that is difficult, but more so the overwhelming amount of information given from different outlets at all times. That makes it almost impossible to really understand what you need to be doing to take care of this animal. What I mean by this is a lot of times people will buy their animals from pet stores, and pet stores most of the time do not give correct information. And because of this, people end up keeping their bearded dragons in enclosures that are not exactly ideal for their health. So as an alternative, I would suggest Rankin's dragons. Now, they are less available, and I will agree to that. But Rankin's dragons basically look exactly like bearded dragons, but in a mini version. They are native to Queensland, Australia, and they reach about 12 inches in length, so about half the size of your regular bearded dragon, which then puts down their average enclosure size to a 36 by 18 by 18 rather than a 4 by 2 by 2. As well as this, they only need a basking spot of 100 degrees Fahrenheit and also need the 30 to 60 humidity range. They have the same diet as a bearded dragon, so if you want a more compact version of a bearded dragon, I would definitely recommend a Rankin's dragon, just due to the fact that they are much smaller and require less space than your average bearded dragon. The next species I'm going to talk about is actually based on my own personal experience. Red-eared sliders are actually considered very difficult animals to keep. But due to their availability, many people find themselves keeping these semi-aquatic turtles in their homes. So they are originally native to the southern United States and the northern parts of Mexico, but due to their introduction, because of the pet trade, they are actually considered invasive species in many places, including Canada. You can sometimes find these turtles being given away for $5 on the side of the road, and that is the problem with this species and why sometimes they're considered beginner-friendly animals, even though they are far from it. These turtles grow from 8 to 11 inches. And according to Reptiles, the guide for turtle care and enclosures would be 10 gallons per inch of shell. So if your turtle is 8 inches, that means your enclosure has to hold 80 gallons of water for one turtle. This is already extremely difficult because water parameters can be something that is honestly complicated to understand. On top of this, their temperature requirements make it even harder. Red-eared sliders need a 104 degrees Fahrenheit surface temperature, as well as an 85 to 90 basking temperature. And the water needs to be 70 to 88 degrees Fahrenheit. All these factors mean keeping a red-eared slider is extremely difficult and even harder for someone who is just getting into the world of reptiles. So my alternative for a red-eared slider would be an eastern box turtle. They are native to southern Ontario and the eastern United States. They grow from 4.5 to 8 inches long, so they are smaller than a red-eared slider. On top of this, they are also a terrestrial species of turtle, meaning they don't need a large water source for them to swim in to be happy. Their recommended minimum enclosure size is a 5.5 foot by 3 foot by 1.5 feet enclosure, or 14 square feet of floor space. And yes, this is a very large enclosure, but compared to taking care of 80 to 100 gallons of water with a full-grown red-eared slider, it is much simpler to just have a larger enclosure for a box turtle. Now, I know this is a reptile list, but we are going to add an amphibian into this list because someone who is looking at reptiles has probably also looked at amphibians, and I think that this would be an interesting way to incorporate another animal that is considered beginner-friendly. Pac-Man frogs, or also known as horned frog, are actually a species of frog native to Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. They're found in moist grasslands where they spend most of their lives partially buried in the soil. They're relatively small animals, getting from 4 to 6 inches long, and they live up to 10 years in captivity. They require a pretty small enclosure, a 24 by 18 by 18 front opening enclosure, and their basking temperatures range from 82 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, as well as a humidity that ranges from 60 to 80%. Now you may be thinking, this animal sounds so easy, why wouldn't it be beginner friendly? Well, realistically, it is. It is a very beginner-friendly animal. But I think what sets them apart, and the reason why I think there's a better alternative, is because people tend to get animals because they want to watch them move. They want to watch their animal do things. And Pac-Man frogs kind of just sit in the dirt all day. Now, for some keepers, like me, who really wants a Pac-Man frog, that's not a big deal because you're getting the animal because you like the animal. But a lot of times, new keepers, like I said, want something that moves, and they'll probably get bored very easily of an animal who is basically just a rock. So instead of that, I recommend getting a species who's actually very active, White's tree frogs. These arboreal frogs are actually from Australia and New Guinea. They reach about 4 inches in length, and they can actually live 16 years in captivity compared to the 10 years of a Pac-Man frog. They need an 18 by 18 by 24 enclosure, which is the same size as the Pac-Man frog, but rather than being horizontal, it's actually vertical. And you can keep these guys in groups. If you have a group of individuals, you will need a larger enclosure, but it is possible to keep them in groups of 2 or 3. They need basking temps of 82 to 84 degrees Fahrenheit, and their humidity only has to sit around 50% with a spike of 70% at night. Other than the fact that I have been told that they are extremely loud and it almost sounds like they are screaming, so maybe don't keep them in your bedroom. These frogs are considered one of the easiest frogs to keep, and I would definitely recommend them more as a beginner-friendly frog rather than the Pac-Man frog, because albeit their care is very similar, these frogs are very active and are well known for their derpy-like behavior, which is definitely something a new keeper would find more interesting and be more likely to continue to care for. And the final species on this list is actually a huge amalgamation of a bunch of different animals, and that is going to be chameleons. Most chameleons are kept similarly with similar requirements, so that is why I'm putting them all in the same general category. But for the sake of this video and to make it simpler for you guys to understand, we are going to base this off panther chameleons, which are very commonly kept and can be found in pet stores. So panther chameleons grow from 16 to 20 inches long, and they require enclosures that are 2 foot by 2 foot by 4 feet high, which is a very large enclosure. And they have to be mesh. Chameleons are very, very fragile animals, meaning they need mesh enclosures to properly regulate the air in the enclosure. They need a basking temp of 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit and a level of humidity from 50 to 60%, with a spike of 75 to 100% at nighttime, which is pretty difficult to manage in a mesh enclosure, especially if you are a new keeper who has less experience trying to manage temperatures and humidity. That being said, with enough research, someone's first animal can 100% be a chameleon. It just requires a lot more research than your average lizard. And because of their fragility, it's just a very hard thing for some new keepers to do. So my alternative would actually be a chameleon gecko. So despite their name, chameleon geckos are not chameleons, but I think they are a good alternative if you want something that has the name chameleon but isn't a chameleon. They're arboreal lizards from New Caledonia, so the same place as crested geckos. They grow from 4 to 7 inches long, and they live 10 years in captivity. They require an 18 by 18 by 24 enclosure, and they need a basking temp of 82 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit and a humidity of 60 to 80%, which could be difficult if you, again, don't understand how to properly maintain humidity, but at least the enclosure is most of the time going to be glass, so it's a little bit easier than trying to manage that in a mesh enclosure. Now, the really fun part about these guys is they can actually eat crested gecko diet, so that actually alleviates a lot of the pressure of feeding, but you must also incorporate insects into their diet. I personally think this is a much easier alternative, and they are just as cool looking as some chameleons. So that's my list of the top 5 not so beginner friendly reptiles. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you wanted to see more, definitely hit that subscribe button or that notification bell. Thank you for watching my video, and I'll see you in the next one.